Brave New World. Wow. Okay, going live. We're live. Wow, it actually worked. Shocking. Hey, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and really happy that today is our first actual program where we're going live simultaneously on Facebook and YouTube. So if there are any glitches, just put them in the comments field. Hopefully I'll sort them out. But today, we're really pleased to have Ed Tarkington here discussing his new book, The Fortunate Ones, and Ashley Winstead, who has, I love the title so much, Ashley. In my dreams, I hold a knife. And we still have some signed copies of this. I'll put both books in the comments field links if you'd like to purchase one. And I'll be in the background monitoring the comments. So if you have questions for Ed or Ashley, just go ahead and put them in. And Barbara will summon me back towards the end of the hour. I'll be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. It's after all, it's October, the magic month. So some people think I'm a witch anyway, and it's a lot of fun to exercise that power. So this is actually the paperback of Ed's book, The Fortunate Sons. So you can buy it from us in either form. And last year, when the hardcover came out, I truly loved it. So it was our notable new fiction book for whatever month it was. I can't remember. What month was it, Ed? January. So a long time ago. And Ashley was a first Mystery Club book of the month for us just a little bit earlier this year. And her book, I absolutely love. But strangely enough, they have common themes, even if they are not in the same location. And certainly they're different genre, if you want to call it that. But see, in my world, it's all just fiction. So I don't really care about labels. So let me tell you about Ed, all I know, which I looked up on his website. So if I'm wrong, Ed, it's still be your fault. Ed Tarkington's debut novel, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, was an American Bookseller Association Indies Introduced selection, an Indie Next Pick, a Book of the Month Club main selection, and a Southern Independent Booksellers Association bestseller. He's a regular contributor to various publications like the Nashville Scene, the Knoxville News Sentinel, and Lit Hub. Now, you may ask, before we go any further, what in the world is an Indie Next Pick and an Indies Introduced? And this is a program that the American Booksellers Association started a long time ago, and they actually called it initially Book Sense, which actually I think makes a lot more sense than Indie Next, because I mean, if you don't know about independent bookstores calling themselves indies, it's going to be completely wasted on you. But the idea is that various independent bookstores around the country get to nominate books that they think are particularly distinguished. And then the top 20 picks every month produce what's called the Indie Next list, formerly the Book Sense list. And as a special part of their program, they take some debut novels, the Indies Introduced part, and nominate those. So Ed got off to a roaring start, but that was his first book, and the book we're now talking about, The Fortunate Ones. Is this your second novel? Am I right in that?
It is, yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he's hit it out of the park again with book two. Right. Ashley has I called this our first mystery club, but Ashley, I have a nagging sense that you wrote something before. In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife.
No, that's my first published, but yeah, there are a lot of shelved.
Okay, that was it. I mean, we've talked 2 or 3 times by now, and I knew there was something lurking in the background. I just couldn't remember what. So her first published novel, In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, which I thought was an absolute wow. So we're talking about entitlement. We're talking about privileged communities. We're talking about culture wars. It's very, very up to date in that sense. And I think it's a subject well worth discussing. So since you've kind of read each other's books, let's see, Ashley, let's see if you have anything you especially would like to add to Ed, and ask Ed, and I'll sort of butt in when I feel like it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Barbara. I think you are just like the best literary matchmaker too, because you told me that I would love this book, and I just love it so much.
Oh.
Ed, it's just, you've seen me gushing on social media probably, but now I get to do it kind of in person. Just so fantastic. I had to put it down so many times to just like let your words resonate just so beautifully, some of the sentences just so beautifully restrained, but packed such a punch. So I have a ton of questions actually, and I will not like ambush you with any of them, but I lived in Nashville. I want to talk about setting. I know you live in Nashville now, right?
Yes,
And
ma'am.
so I used to live in Nashville, and I was just I've been telling everyone who will listen to me just how vividly and how well you captured Nashville, particularly like this. I mean, you're kind of, this book, The Fortunate Ones, is looking across class divides in Nashville, and it's in Belle Meade, you know, it's in East Nashville, it's in different places, but you know, I'm just curious about why you decided to set this book in Nashville besides living there. I know your first was set in Virginia, so why did this book have to be in Nashville?
Thank you, Ashley, and really thank you so much. I'm really flattered that you were willing to do this. This book is lights out. It's really good. And I just think that you're super cool and awesome. And it's an honor to be able to have a conversation with you. I started out, you know, it was a combination of laziness because I live here. And I mean, not really laziness so much as just, you know, where I am in my life right now. I've got young kids and I have to still have a job, and, you know, I just don't have the luxury of taken off to go, you know, explore some other place or, you know, do a lot of research. But the other thing was that at the time that I started writing this, that was when all of a sudden Nashville was getting in a lot of the national news. And those of us who live here felt kind of, and I only moved here in 2007. So you know, it was still pretty new. And at that part of it was kind of fun and exciting to me to be living in a place that all of a sudden, it was the first time I'd ever lived in any place that people thought was cool. Right.
Yep.
But it seemed like they were, you know, one of two things happened. Either one, they ruined all my favorite restaurants by making them so popular that you can't get a table anymore, or two, they just kind of got it wrong. They sort of bought into this image of Nashville as being, you know, 10-gallon hats and cowboy boots and country music, which is a significant segment of life here. But as you know, having been at Vanderbilt, that really isn't what it's like here for most people. And so I just thought, oh, well, you know, I'm going to write a corrective here a little bit to kind of show people what, you know, what Nashville's really like. And at the time it was sort of circumstantial, and it was fun, you know. And then I thought, you know, at some point I was like, well, maybe I ought to put this in a different place so I don't get in trouble with anybody who thinks that, you know, I'm being critical or you know, not portraying it in a flattering light. But the further along I got, the more it sort of seemed like it was the right city for this type of story because of the changes that it's been going through, where you've really seen a lot of culture clash here. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Nashville became a bit of a bellwether for the rest of the country in terms of having, you know, as you pointed out, East Nashville with this creative class, you know, Belle Meade and that whole area with, you know, pretty astonishing affluence. You know, politics is weird here because it's predominantly, I mean, you've got a Democratic majority, but it's still not, it's not a, I mean, we call ourselves a blue island, but not really. I mean, it's about, you know, 35-40% pretty conservative. Then of course, Williamson County to the south, Brentwood is extremely conservative. And so I just thought, wow, this thing's so kind of, I can't think of a place, plus it's really grown just astronomically since I've been here. And I couldn't think of, you know, a better place to tell that kind of story. So I just stuck with it. And so far, everybody that I've met from all the different types of places that has read it seems to feel like I got it right and nobody has yelled at me or thrown rocks at me yet. So
That's good to hear. Yeah, to echo that, I just, not only is it so vividly Nashville, but just like you said, capturing the transition and the growth. I think we just overlapped because I was leaving Vanderbilt in 2008 and was already starting to see the high rise, you know, a lot of the high rises go up, and now that I go back to visit, it's just a completely different place. And yeah, and just so interesting. The setting is so perfect because obviously so many of the characters in your novel are desperate to hold on to the old ways, which is something that I feel like, I don't know, I'd love for you to talk about that, but something that I feel like Charlie is both, our main character is both seduced by and kind of compelled by, but also is this like vanguard or bellwether or force for change and growth. So I'm curious about that. I'm also curious, I'm sorry, Barbara, jump in and cut me off so I don't dominate asking.
No. I want to come back to talk about Nashville from my perspective in a minute, but carry on.
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, as Barbara touched on, your book deals so much with class, it divides and entitlement. And I've just been thinking a lot about the uniquely Nashville of it all, like and just wondering from your perspective if there are things that are, you know, some uniquely Nashville class divides or way that class stratification works in Nashville that you're kind of showing in the book. And I guess one of the things that really struck me was the sheer affability of every single character in your book, just like how darn nice everyone is all the time, no matter what they're doing. And that just felt so right.
Well, you know, it's funny that you say that because when I first moved here, one of the first things I noticed was how even when I just stopped to get, you know, gas for my truck the first time I pulled into town, how like the lady behind the counter was like, "Hey, honey, you know, and yeah, you know, you have a blessed day." And I was just like, gosh, people are really nice here. And I haven't been in a place like that in maybe ever, you know. I think though, you know, per the class issues, it's a combination of factors. And I'm interested to hear your perspective on this with Winston as well, because it's not the deep South, it's the upper South, and Tennessee is really kind of, I mean, divided into these three segments of the South that are culturally very different from each other, right? Memphis is you know, so deep South that it's really the capital of Mississippi. Nashville is kind of in the middle. East Tennessee is more, you know, Appalachian, and even though the culture there has changed so much, there's still a kind of rugged independence about the way that people live there. But here it's sort of like the, you know, the old the prevailing kind of predominant you know, mood is the sort of polite, genteel, kind, moderate, you know, bless her heart kind of upper South. And people here until very recently, and I think this is true of a lot of places in the South, have kind of lived sort of in this denial of the fact that, you know, there was ever, for instance, you know, violence related to lunch counter sit-ins during the civil rights movement, or, you know, they try to pretend, or I wouldn't say pretend, but it just was sort of like this, everybody kind of had this collective amnesia about the fact that, it, you know, there was a lot of racism here, and that there still remains, you know, really profound cultural and socioeconomic segregation. Then you combine that with the fact that, you know, the creative class has moved here in droves, not just in the music industry, but in every imaginable industry for a lot of different reasons, which I think is in a lot of ways sort of symbolized by East Nashville, which was already booming when you were living here. And I'm sure you heard about it, even if you didn't go over there very much. And that has changed the politics of the city, because you do have enough progressives living in the city now that you can kind of, you know, pitch to them if you're running for a citywide election. And we did in 2015. This was really what kind of inspired the novel. We had a very contentious mayoral election between a transplant who would come here for, you know, kind of tech business job, who was a progressive running on and became the first female mayor of Nashville. And the guy that she was running against was, you know, a hedge fund manager who, you know, was, you know, a lifelong Nashvilleian, lived on, Whitland Avenue, not in Belmead, but, very kind of nearby. And it's kind of representative, although I think, in real life, he's probably more progressive, but in the campaign, he was sort of representative of, the kind of Belmead perspective on city politics. So like, let's don't change too much. We don't want to end up like Atlanta. And that thing kind of hit me like, oh gosh, it's happening, right? We're now like a city that there's kind of a fight over, what the future is going to look like. And as a kind of an outsider, I mean, I've lived here long enough to complain about the new people, but I still don't feel like I really belong here. And so it's always, it just feels, probably like Tocqueville felt when he was traveling around the United States, although I'm not comparing myself to Tocqueville. But it just, I feel like a tourist still in a lot of ways, even though I've been rubbernecking this culture for a long time.
Same, makes for good writing.
It does. It does.
I lived in Nashville, or not Nashville, Tennessee, in the second half of the 1960s. Let me tell you, it was a long time ago. And Ed is so right that Tennessee, being long and thin, even the time zone bisects it, is really three different cultures. The east part, Knoxville is an old river city, was an old river city, and very much Appalachian, much closer to North Carolina and Southwest Virginia. Memphis, as Ed said, really might as well be the capital of Mississippi. It too is a river town, Mississippi River, and its ties are very much to the deep South. And it does have, a music tradition, a very good one of its own. Also has ducks, I mean, the Peabody Hotel is what you tend to think of in old Memphis. That was a reason to go there. And Nashville is kind of the pivot. And back then, Tennessee was not an economically well engineered state. It was generally poor. Parts of it were poorer than others. But Nashville's sitting in the middle. And with I-40 running across it from Knoxville to Nashville to Memphis and then on to the west, was really well situated to become the economic heart of Tennessee in a way that neither Memphis nor Knoxville was really going to be able to do. Some of the rehab of Tennessee started with the TVA project, because really until the rivers were tamed during that period up before World War II, it was a very chancy place anyway, because it flooded all the time. They didn't, power was uncertain. There were all kinds of problems with it. So back then, if you thought about Nashville, you barely even thought about country music. And Vanderbilt seemed like an island, completely out of context. I mean, I remember going over there. I was getting my master's in library science in Knoxville, and I remember going over to Nashville for some classes and thinking, what? Why is this university, here in this particular place? But I am not at all surprised. If you're in publishing, the Ingram Book Company, which is a gigantic part of the publishing industry, is located in Nashville. And as Ed said, once you get something going, stuff accretes, right? It begins to stick, and then you get a whole momentum going. I think about Austin, Texas, for example, being very similar to Nashville. And in the South, Winston-Salem and Durham, are very much economic centers, thanks to the universities and so forth. So I think Nashville is a wonderful place, to set a book where basically what you're doing is writing kind of a modern Gatsby, aren't you? In many respects, that's the obvious analog that people use.
Well, I will say, and I think that, that is a very flattering comparison. And the first person who made that comparison was my friend Paula McLean, who gave me a wonderful blurb for the book that's on the hardcover in the front of the paperback. But I swear I am not making this up. I've got a Bible right here. I'm putting my hand on it. I never thought about The Great Gatsby when I was writing this book, not a single time, not until she said that. Now, I am not denying that was, I think that I've read and loved that book for so long that it must have just, kind of gotten into my DNA a little bit. I remember one time I read it and I said, I'm going to underline every perfect sentence in The Great Gatsby. And I had to stop on about page 3 because I was just going to have to underline pretty much the whole book. But the book I was thinking about when I wrote this was not The Great Gatsby. It was Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh.
Really?
And I don't know if you all know that book. For those of you out there watching, it's a wonderful book. It's very, very sharp. And it was made into a BBC TV miniseries in the early 80s, which was kind of Jeremy Irons' first big kind of star
Yes.
turn.
And Anthony, whatever his name was, the beautiful
That's
boy.
right. Mhm.
Yeah.
Now he kind of disappeared, but Jeremy Irons went on to a
Wasn't
great
Laurence
career.
Olivier the father?
Laurence Olivier was the father, and the mother was Claire Bloom.
Yeah, it was a magnificent cast and
Mhm.
beautifully. It was set at one of those great English country houses. It was
That's
great
right.
television.
That's right. I just I read that book and I just ate it up, and I thought, and I watched the show. I've seen it probably 2 or 3 times. It's really, really good, and it really inspired me because it's set sort of post World War I, between the wars, and it's kind of representative of the decline of or the culture change that occurred between the wars and really accelerated after the wars, where it's the same story of Downton Abbey or the Remains of the Day, where the old really wealthy class, the landed gentry, the aristocracy in England began to have to sell off their property and their big homes because these estates were no longer really yielding, a lot of money, and they were sort of in decline. But at the beginning of the novel, which starts when these guys are in college, this, the beautiful boy that you mentioned, his family is, fabulously wealthy, and he kind of adopts his friend Charles. That's not a coincidence that my character's name's Charlie. And he becomes, Charles, infatuated with this world of the wealthy elite, but also, looking at it with a bit of a jaundiced eye as an outsider. And I just thought, ooh, that's exactly what it's like here when you have, the collision of worlds, which occurs a lot at places like Vanderbilt. It occurs at schools like the one that I depicted in here, where you have, talented people who did not come from a lot of affluence or a history of class, suddenly, rubbing elbows with and being befriended by people who are, both wealthy and in a lot of cases, have a family history of social graces or social connections, society people. And I just thought, ooh, I want to write an American version of that and a Southern version of that, where you have kind of a lot of those same conflicts in play. But then as it turned out, I guess, just, when it came out the other end, people seemed to think they saw the Gatsby in it, and I can't argue with it at all. It wasn't a conscious theft, but I'm not gonna deny that it's there.
Wow, Ashley has done the same thing so well in her magnificent book. It really is so similar when you have these young people arriving at college, and some of them are affluent and some of them have really tough backgrounds. And I love your comment, Ashley, that you made when we talked about the book, that the Southern University that you had that in mind was kind of always trying to catch up with the Ivy League, that there was a sort of a complex that these schools had about not being, as Ivy League, but in their own way, they were behaving like Ivy League colleges for the people that they had drawn in.
Yeah, funny enough that Duquette, the fictional university in my book, is modeled after Vanderbilt, like very closely, where I went to school, but also a little bit Duke and also a little bit Wake Forest, of course. And I was saying to Barbara that what I knew is that it had to be a Southern Ivy, because my book was just my main character is kind of just obsessed with being second best, not being, the kind of not being the winner, not coming out on top. And I thought, what better setting to reflect this kind of inferiority complex or this chip on your shoulder than this group of schools that all call themselves the Ivy of the South. And so I just knew, and of course I was also so fascinated in the fact that if you go to a school like Vanderbilt or Duke or whatever else, you've got that really rigorous academic competition, but then you also have that kind of Southern social world, that Greek world of social hierarchy that you have to grapple with. Not that you don't at other colleges, but just it imbues the culture so much. And I was kind of fascinated to try to depict that.
Yeah, I'm still just about halfway through. I'm loving it, and I'm really seeing that strongly in here. And I love the way that you have been able to, tell a class story in the genre that, of course, is much loved genre, and get people interested in something, like they're trying to get to the end because they want to see the resolution of the plot, but they also suddenly are immersed in these culture conflicts. Now that you mentioned that, and I was wondering, okay, did you feel, okay, I have to kind of get away from Vanderbilt? Did you feel for your imagination that you needed to be in a place that, to create a place that was less familiar? Could you talk about your choices there?
Yeah, and I love that question too, since we were talking about you being in Nashville and being able to access it. So I did kind of do the opposite, where I needed to leave Nashville. I needed to leave Vanderbilt and be get some distance from it. So I think I started writing in my dreams, or the idea came to me a few months after my own 10-year college reunion. So I had the experience of going back. And I really lionized my college years in my mind, like it was the best time of my life. And I think that, I felt very similar to Charlie in just his awe of Yateman. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
Just that awe where you feel like you're the luckiest person in the world who's been plucked out of obscurity. And I was first generation college student. So going to Vanderbilt was a huge deal for not only me, but lots of other people. And so I think, I don't know, once again, like the Charlie in the situation, but my college experience was this really kind of glamorous in my head, opening of the world. And it's like where my life really started. So that's how I always pictured it. And, I was kind of obsessed with going back for my 10-year college reunion, went back and was so underwhelmed, was so gutted by the fact that that even though everything was the same, or maybe even better, because obviously Vanderbilt has just kept going and growing, and that nothing felt the way that it had. And I had that's of course that sense of like nostalgia for a home that never really existed, just existed in your head. And that really got the wheels turning in my dreams, thinking about a woman who had a similar experience, but rather than letting it go and understanding that you do have to move on, she's just determined to kind of recreate and master, this period of her life, I guess.
So why Winston-Salem?
So my honest answer is that I was thinking about setting it in Nashville and probably should have, but didn't want the parallels to Vanderbilt to be just too extreme.
Right.
And so I'm familiar with Winston-Salem, have friends who live there. So really just chose it out of like, this is a kind of corollary to what I'm writing. So I basically Duquette and Winston-Salem like is an amalgamation of all the Southern Ivies that I've been to, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good choice. And I mean, as Barbara was saying, I think it's, my impression of Winston is that in a lot of ways, it's sort of like just Nashville on a smaller scale, and that it fits right into the themes that you're working in.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right about, how peculiar it is when you're in these really, academically elite schools, that there's still this clubby, preppy, kind of like you're in, but you're not really in kind of, world that exists. And it's true at Duke, it's true at Wake, it's true at Vanderbilt, it's true at UVA, where, there's really almost like two games going on there, right? And that is a sharp thing to approach in writing, and I know people love it, so because I'm loving it.
Thank you. I not to dive too deep into politics, but what you just said made me also think about the uniqueness of the political climate for Southern Ivies, and this is certainly true of your book, though I didn't really go there in mine. But just thinking about the fact that not only are these schools, everything we just described, but they also tend to be bastions for Southern conservative elite families, kind of when I showed up at Vanderbilt with my, everything I owned, my flip-flops from Florida and,
Right.
Whatnot, I was like, whoa, everyone around me is this is an exaggeration, but everyone around me is politically conservative. And I'm now going to school with, the great grandson of this major conservative figure, and struggling with feeling the tension between being so grateful to be there and wanting to be part of that world, and also having some real deep reservations and criticisms. And so I feel like that's where Charlie is too, or at least kind of where he moves. So I'm curious if you have drawn that from your own experience teaching, because I know you were teaching at a school like Yeatman. Just curious about that kind of like twinned desire and critique.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of it is I will say, I still teach at a school that is very similar in design. And, it would be ridiculous to pretend that I didn't draw from that. But it's not really, it's more of a framework for a setting than it is any of my own experience, because not one single character incident in this book is based on anything that I've observed or participated in, or anybody that I've known through where I work. Most of it was from when I was an undergraduate at Furman University in upstate South Carolina, which is, a little bit less elite than Vanderbilt, but exactly the same in terms of culture, probably more conservative than Vanderbilt. And, all the stuff that happens, I mean, it did occur to me as a teacher at a school that has a fabulous endowment and is kind of the school of choice for people who are, wealthy beyond my imagination, but also a really, really generous school that really works hard to recruit as many students as possible, working really hard to improve our equity, inclusivity, and socioeconomic diversity. But what comes along with that sometimes is that you're going to have a student who is from a very poor family and is on financial aid in this school, and is sitting next to a kid whose grandfather is literally a billionaire. And the kid whose grandfather is a billionaire is probably a sweetheart. I mean, most of the boys that I know that are in that situation are really well-mannered and humble, given relative to their circumstances, and don't flex at all about their wealth, but they also have no comprehension of what it's like not to live that way, right? And then you're sitting next to a kid whose, entire home or apartment could fit in the front hallway of, that family's house and you've been down Belmead Boulevard. It's like something out of a dream. And I just thought how hard that would be and how strange that would be. And again, thinking about the characters in Brideshead Revisited, or about now thinking about Gatsby as a guy who saw that and just thought, that is it. That is the promised land. I want to be a part of that. And the difficulty is when you climb into that world, you discover that it's not as pretty as you thought it was. And that in order to, hold on to your connection, if your connection is through a family or through a person, you're going to have to kind of go along with, or at least pretend to be okay with things that you might not really be okay with. And I think that is a really, really difficult thing. Somebody asked me, a couple of years ago, what is your new book going to be about? And I said, oh, it's going to be about, why poor people are in love with rich people, when they really ought to,
I love that.
want to burn their whole thing down. And I don't know if I answered that question, but I felt like I explored my own kind of conflicted relationship with those things as someone, who probably definitely went along with some stuff when I was in college, because I wanted to fit in with these guys who came from, these, really highfalutin Southern backgrounds. And I thought they were so cool. And I felt like, it gave me an identity. And I outgrew that, but I could see how somebody wouldn't. And I think it's a little bit harder journey for my character than it was for me. But that's the whole thing, right? And you're doing the same thing. You're right into your dark place. You're right into your place where if I gave in to my darker impulses or my anger or my resentment, this is where I would go. And so, I think that was what I was trying to do. And I mean, look at the world we're living in right now. This is every day you're confronted with this reality. And I think novels are a good place to try and figure out where you are on all of those things, both as a reader and as a writer.
But what an old form of storytelling it is to have someone who comes from one kind of background, a poorer one, either aspiring or accidentally stumbling into a higher one, and then discovering whether they fit or not. You could talk Cinderella here.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
If you want to really back, you could go back to one of the great pot boilers of all time, Forever Amber, which I must have read when I was like 12 years old or something. And this woman, despite, everything that happens and all the wealth and other stuff she acquires, never can get the boy that was the sort of prince on the estate, ever perceives her as anything other than this kind of serf that she started out being. She was never able to elevate herself to, in his eyes, be an equal, even as she was like mistress to the king or something. And did you think, Ed, was it always going to be that something would, I don't want to say bad things happen, but it was always headed for some kind of real pain and possible crime? I know with Ashley it was, because she's in the genre, so it's perfectly clear that something really awful is going to happen. But
I chose
in your case, it kind of, did you know from the beginning when you started out that there was going to have to be some really serious disappointment?
Absolutely. I'll tell you, and I'll try to keep this short. I don't want to talk too much, but part of what made me want to write a book about politics is, I grew up, most of my family is Republican. I didn't switch sides until I fell in love in college, which I think, if you asked all those guys who had to go testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee in the 1950s, like, why'd you go to those communist meetings? That probably about 95% of them, if they were telling the truth, they'd say, well, there was this girl, and, but, I still don't see either side of the political spectrum as being, the right one, even though it's getting harder, right? I still want to look for the good in the side that I don't necessarily side with, and acknowledge that the side that I do side with isn't always right and always perfect. And I just remember, that experience of kind of disillusionment with people that I respected, and I just struggling with the realities of how it works, where, these elected officials often have to make these compromises and get in front of a microphone and say things that they don't really believe, and if they don't, they're not going to be able to get reelected, or they're not going to be able to get what they need out of these other people. And what it really came down to for me was the day of the Sandy Hook shootings. And I was at work. I was coaching wrestling at the time, and I'd gone into the office to check on something, and just sort of noticed there was this news story about a school shooting, and I didn't process it right away. And then after practice was over, the coaches all went in there, and we sat there and we watched the news, and just kind of it started to sink in. And then I got in the car and I was driving home, and I was listening to NPR, and I became so overcome with grief and horror that I actually had to pull over, because if I didn't, I felt like I was going to get in an accident. I was, it was just one of those, how could this possibly have happened? I had a daughter who was the exact same age as those children at the time. And it was, the worst nightmare of a parent come to life. And I thought to myself when I got home, okay, this is it. This is what it's going to take finally for people to realize that, it doesn't make sense for military assault weapons to be available to just anybody. And then it didn't happen. Nothing changed, right? And I thought, okay, how do you live with yourself? And then I thought, what if somebody couldn't live with himself, right? What if somebody was in that position and finally realized this is a bridge too far? This is one time where I've, gone along because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. And it was just, how bad does it have to get before you decide that your choices are morally unacceptable and you can't live with yourself anymore? And so I knew that was where I wanted to start, was with a guy who decided that he couldn't live with himself over the things that he had done for power. Someone who did experience regret and remorse, someone who did suddenly kind of have a, 3 a.m. look in the mirror moment. And that might be harsh, but that was where I started. And I haven't really changed my mind about that. I still feel, as much as I want to understand why people make these compromises, it's just not for me. I don't get it. So I've tried to write about it in a way that I thought was honest and three-dimensional and not judge anybody. I didn't want there to be any heroes or any villains in this book. And I want everybody to be a little bit chipped and nobody to be really all that bad. And I wanted my narrator to grow and maybe start out a little bit better and find some peace and grace by the end. And, it's entirely up to anybody who will do me the courtesy of reading it as to whether or not I was able to pull that off.
I think you absolutely did. Just the nuance in this book is so gorgeous. I'm thinking a lot about, Arch and the other characters, and kind of to connect to what we're talking about. So many of them are determined at some point in the book to rebel against their parents or to do things differently. I think this is true of Charlie, of Arch, to some extent, Jamie and Vanessa. But I think without giving away any spoilers, they find it very difficult to not repeat the things that their parents did before them. And in some cases, they, actively choose to kind of follow in their parents' footsteps. So I've been thinking a lot about, fate and inheritance in your novel, and, the way that they work, if they're even different, from each other, if if those things mean different things, like, you know, are some of your characters fated to end up where they ended up, or is it, you know, is inheritance a kind of fate that marks you down a certain path? Just curious your thoughts about like inheritance and
Yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I mean, I'm thinking about the same thing with your book, right? I
yeah.
mean, can you take a character out of, or can a person like Jessica come, you know, sort of jump worlds or whatever and really become remade? Or you know, are we inevitably kind of always going to be, I don't know. What do you think? Was that on your mind?
Yeah, that was on my mind, writing in my dreams. And I think, you know, again, I'm not going to spoil the end of the book for you, but
Mhm.
one of the things I was really interested in doing is showing how Jessica and other characters' acceptance of fate and truly their acceptance of their parents' paths.
Right.
You know, the fact that they didn't rebel against them or imagine a different way to be, imagine like, you know, they did not burn the world down the way that we were talking about. They came into this world that was working a certain way, this kind of classist, neoliberal, very hierarchical world, and they just swallowed it whole. And they simply said, you know, well, slot me in where I
Right.
belong, and I'm going to
Mhm.
try to keep climbing from there, instead of, you know, saying like, let's get rid of this whole thing. And so that I was really interested in showing how that over and over again in the characters' choices is kind of what, if tragic things are going to happen to them, it's that choice over and over again that kind of dooms them. And so it's a little bit of an inheritance, but also the way that, you know, kind of a choice repeated, kind of misunderstanding about the way the world works.
Mhm.
You
That's
know, both
great.
of your books made me think of the cheating scandal because the focus has been on the parents. The focus has been on, you know, the two of them were just convicted, you know. And my question is, what about the children whose parents bought them into these universities? How are their classmates looking at them? How is the university looking
Mhm.
at them? How do they feel about themselves? Do they think, well, I could have made it anyway if dad hadn't ponied up, or mom, all this money? And, you know, if I couldn't and they bought me this thing, is it real? And what will that do to the whole rest of their lives? Nobody's really looking at the kids at this point. Are there
That's
any
such,
penalties for them? Are they being kicked out of school? I mean, you
I
know,
think
I
a few
find
of
it
them
really
have. Yeah.
fascinating.
I will
Um,
never forget the I think my freshman year of college, becoming really good friends with this guy, and him just very casually in the course of a conversation about something else talking to me about how his parents had really paid his way into college, and like if they hadn't made the donations that they'd made and done the networking that they'd done, you know, there was no way he would have gotten in. And he said it very casually, very blasé, and it has obviously stuck with me for many, many years later. But it kind of compels me to think that it's really not that big of a deal. Maybe it's so quotidian, and there's such a sense of like, this is the way the world works, or, you know, I'm entitled to this, so whatever way I need to get it, whatever way it's going to get dropped into my lap, is
I
the way it's
think,
going to
yeah.
happen. That's a dark perspective, but
Mhm. No, that's certainly something that I've thought a lot about, and it's certainly something that comes up in both of these books, where you've got these characters uh, who don't really have a very some who do, but some who don't really have a very conflicted relationship with their advantages, and they are kind of, I mean, only now in the last really 2 to 4 years has there been, you know, a serious conversation. Like, it's been going on in literature since the beginning of time. It's been going on in storytelling at, you know, every level, but in the kind of cultural conversation, a serious examination of, you know, why a certain type of person thinks that they deserve to be in charge, and that they are the ones who ought to call the shots, and that, yeah, we'll, you know, we'll accommodate you, but we are the standard. We set the standard, and we're going to tell you what's best for you. And it used to be, certainly, in Europe, it's always been aristocratic. In the United States, it started out, a little bit more related to gentry. Now it's related to what we call the meritocracy, as well as inherited wealth. And now what you're seeing is that the whole concept of the meritocracy is really sort of, not fraudulent, but deceptive, because the people who have the merit, the majority of them had tremendous advantages. And where does the advantage start? Now, certainly having the ability to buy your way into an elite university with a $1 million donation is extravagant, but anybody that's coming out of an elite prep school is starting 10 moves ahead on the chessboard. Anybody who has 2 college educated parents that made them do their homework every night and put a lot of pressure on them and provided programs and opportunities for them, they're starting ahead on the chessboard. And the key is, do you acknowledge that? And I honestly think your friend, this, or I don't know if you would consider this person a friend, but just to be so honest with himself about the fact that he didn't earn his way in is probably, it's kind of refreshing in a way.
Yes, much love to him wherever he is, for sure.
Right, and not to be, well, better that than that he thought that. I mean, he deserved it. Right?
Yeah,
He knew it was bought and paid for, and it's cynical, but it's at least straightforward, right? I mean, my character Jamie at the beginning, when they're talking about well, what's special about you? You're obviously a financial aid kid. What's your talent? And Charlie's like, I don't know. What's special about you? And he's like, look around.
I love that part so much. It's so good.
Right. And there are some people who have that level of honesty with themselves. I don't know. But I think that, kind of back to the original question, the only way this is ever going to really stop is if, all of these people out there say enough is enough, right? The people who don't have the advantages. And I don't see that happening because they don't want the world to be fair and equal. They want to be like the people who have all the stuff.
Yes.
Think of the French Revolution. I mean, how did
Exactly.
that work out? It was a blow for equality. They wound up with an autocrat called Napoleon.
Right.
And, it didn't go. And if you, like I have to read a lot of thrillers, one of the things you really know about in China, which, likes to bill itself under communism as some kind of equal or meritocracy, you learn about the Red Princes. And the Red Princes are every bit, the kind of people that we're talking about, not any different than the Britons who went to Oxford and Cambridge and came out. There was a review in the journal today about Silverview, the new John le Carre. And I mean, the old John le Carre.
Right.
Whatever.
Well, I take Harper's. I read the little excerpt they had in there.
But I mean, he once again points out, this kind of class that that runs things and that is virtually impenetrable for anyone outside it. I mean, your speech, the slang that you use, that there's so many codes involved that a person not raised in it can never ever learn it. It's like a foreign language or something. You can never pick up on it. You will never be one of them in a capital T, but anyway, I really think your books are extraordinary. And I was so taken with the parallels, and I'm sitting here hating myself for not have thought about Brideshead, because you're absolutely right. Brideshead is a way better analog for your book than Gatsby. And, even thinking about it at the end, after all the stuff that goes on, at the end, when the man is dying, he can't resist reaffirming his Catholic faith, having spent a lifetime pushing away from it. And in the end, he goes back. So Ashley, your question, nature versus nurture, can we in fact ever really shake that, how we were formed as children, our experiences, can we ever overcome them?
What do you
In
think,
my book,
Ashley?
not so much. But I was just thinking, I like to say as a tagline for my book that it's about the way trying to make the meritocracy real and take it seriously will slowly drive you mad and unravel you. So this is feeling a lot of parallels with that. And just thinking about Arch too, and how he is such a poster child for the meritocracy, because you want to look at him and say, well, you have so much because you come from this wealthy family, but he's also just so good at everything. He's so flawlessly good at everything, and he's like the proof in the pudding, I guess.
Well,
but you know people like this, right? I mean, you know people like this. It is true that sometimes these princes have gifts and they are just, exceptional, and certainly they have started with a lot of advantages, but they're strivers and they're smart and they work hard. And
there's an intangible gift called charm. That, well, there is, and people
give me some. How do I find it?
It really is a remarkable thing how charm can make an incredible difference. I'm going to call Patrick up in my magical way, but I did want to say that one thing we haven't actually talked about, because they're probably both too modest, is what wonderful prose they both write. Both our authors here, and Ashley. It's not just the content of the book, but it's the style of the books that really, I think, elevate them. And I think it's good for us to read books that are really well written, because there are a lot of books that aren't. And it kind of raises you to read a book, I think, that is so well crafted and so well written, which is why I'm so smitten with both of them. So Patrick, come and talk to us. You may have questions of your own, or we may have questions from the audience.
Well, I think you've awed them. There are no questions really, except for, let's see, Tony wants to know, maybe if you could each name a couple of your favorite books that have inspired you, and what are you reading right now?
Ashley?
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, a book that I reread probably every month or so is actually a book of poetry called Crush by Richard Sykin. And I think he won the Yale Younger Poets Award back in 2004, but I reread it because this book of poetry, I can't recommend it enough. It feels like experiencing someone else's panic attack unfolding in slow motion, which doesn't necessarily maybe sound like an experience you'd want to have, but it is gorgeous and so raw. And I think if I did anything right with my prose, and in my dreams I hold a knife, I credit to trying to just capture that sense of the Richard Sykin way of writing about the world. So I love that, but I will also say that I am in the middle of it's right here, Megan Collins' The Family Plot, that came out in August, and it's phenomenal. Eerie, creepy, like Umbrella Academy meets true crime kind of vibes, and it's fabulous.
Well, the book I'm reading right now is so good, and I can't wait to get back to it as soon as I'm done. It's called In My Dreams, I Hold the Knife, and it's fantastic. So anyone who's watching that doesn't already have a copy of this book, I highly encourage you to pick one up ASAP from the Poisoned Pen. I mentioned Brideshead as being an inspiration. I actually have a few here. This is called Graceland at Last by Margaret Rinkle, and Late Migrations by Margaret Rinkle. If you have a copy of my book and you open it up, you'll see that one of the dedicatees is Margaret Rinkle. She's my mentor and my hero, and she's a genius. And if you haven't heard about Late Migrations and read it, I really hope you'll check it out. Another one of my heroes, the late great Brad Watson. This is his book, Aliens in the Prime of Their Lives. His last book, Miss Jane, was a finalist for the National Book Award. He passed away suddenly of a heart attack in the first summer of COVID. And I think he was absolutely brilliant and just a really wonderful man. And there's a story in his first collection that, for those of you that are mystery fans, was one of the best mystery stories in that collection that comes out when it came out. It's called Kindred Spirits. It's drop dead brilliant. A good friend of mine, Michael Knight, teaches at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, is a genius writer. This is his book at Briarwood School for Girls that just came out year before last. It's so good. And then last but not least, I just finished an advanced copy of O. William by Elizabeth Strout. And I just revere her. When I grow up, I want to be Elizabeth Strout. I know I'm never going to grow up, so it's beyond the realm of possibility, but it'll be out in a couple of weeks, I think.
Oh, it's out now.
Oh, has it already come out? Okay.
Yeah, it is out now. And
I think she's coming to
amazing.
Nashville next week, maybe. I think.
Oh, lucky you. Wow.
With Susan
that's fun.
Orley, and it's going to be awesome. And Ann Patchett, so it'll be good.
Great.
Yeah.
So Ashley, was there any other pressing question that you would like to have asked that somehow we managed not to cover?
I have a whole list of questions, but maybe I'll just email Ed later. Probably none pressing, just diving into his fabulous characters. But yeah, I'll hold my peace with that.
All right. Well, I'm so glad that we were able to get you two together. It's really been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank all of you who are listening. We will have a podcast as well of this available in the next day or so, as well as the video both on YouTube and Facebook. At least we hope so. So you could recommend it to friends. I think there were many points in this discussion that it's really worth exploring with your own friends. And I could say both of these are great book club books. There's an awful lot to talk about and worth talking about. So if you belong to a book club, I would encourage you to suggest both Ed's title, The Fortunate Ones, and Ashley's book, In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. And in fact, you can imagine it might even be a good idea to read them together and have a discussion. All right. So thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.